You've heard me many times on this channel talk about how a lot of these war firsters and people who want to prioritize the needs of other nations above our own is harmful to our national security. And especially those who want to keep sending all of our cash to all these different places instead of taking care of needs of the United States, or even just not spending the money and going further into debt, is harmful to us. Oftentimes, though, some of these warnings kind of falls on deaf ears, or at least it may be not evident just what that damage is and what the harm is. Today, I'm going to show you just how empty the threats and the claims of these people who advocate these kinds of actions are. And I'm going to show you what the harm to our country really is. And this should alarm you, because it's definitely alarming me, because of when you see the context here, and especially we're talking over many, many years of these kinds of trends moving in a negative direction, the cumulative risk and damage to our country is going to only grow. And if we don't stop this pretty quick, as you'll see in the last part of this segment here, it's unclear just how harmful it could be. And in fact, as you're going to see in a separate show this afternoon, which I'll talk about at the end, it could be catastrophic. So let's just jump right into it. So on March 6th, that date's important, just about a week or so ago, we had investor David Sachs on our show. And for those who may not know him, he, along with Elon Musk, were the creators of PayPal. And quite a few other things that he's done over his career as well. But that's where one of the first places he came to fame. And he's really good at being able to see how things work and how organizations work, which ones fail, which ones succeed, because he also invests in quite a number of other companies. And we were talking about the issue about these war firsters, or the neocons, as some called them. And he said, listen, some of these guys are so predictable. Here's what they say when things go wrong. And he was specifically talking about Afghanistan, which ironically, because of something happened 2 days ago, was more pertinent than I believed. Here's what he had to say.
Neocons always have this Dolchstoss, or stabbed in the back narrative, to explain why all of their harebrained schemes go awry. You saw this after the forever wars in the Middle East, where they said, well, we just didn't stay long enough in Afghanistan. We could have won. That could have turned out right if it was all the people who wanted to leave. They cut and run, that they were the problem. They're the ones who cost us that war. They'll never admit it was just a stupid idea to get involved in the first place. So they're going to blame the people who were always opposed to their policy, who warned and advised against their policy and said it was foolish. And they're eventually going to blame those people and say that it was because they gave up hope and they pulled the rug out from under our allies and they didn't show faith that this scheme went awry. That's what's going to happen here.
Well, little did I know that just 4 days after that, there was going to be a report out that said that claimed that, I think it was a U.S. intelligence report that claimed that ISIS in Afghanistan was starting to grow in their capacities, and that it was an alarming development for some. And boy, it did not take long at all for Jack Keane, one of the biggest cheerleaders of the war firsters, to leap into action and almost verbatim read from David Sachs's playbook when he said this.
President Biden's military advisors, from the on-scene commander in Afghanistan all the way to the chairman and the Secretary of Defense, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and all of our allies, all 6 nations who were there with us in Afghanistan, all said, keep the forces here to prevent ISIS and al-Qaeda from growing into a menace that will threaten our countries. And what did we do? We made a decision to conduct an unconditional surrender. We pulled out our 3 CIA bases, our 7 military bases were shut down, and we said we will still maintain contact with Afghanistan over the horizon. An 8-hour flight by a reconnaissance airplane to get there, 4 hours only on the target, 8 hours to return. That is not much capability trying to keep your eyes and ears on what is going on. This is a menace that's growing. It's attacking inside of Afghanistan. It's beginning to attack the region, and it'll grow into a menace that can attack Europe and the United States.
So there's always this fierce warning that, oh my God, they're all going to come after us next. Is this something familiar already? Because we're already seeing this issue in play out on the Russia-Ukraine war, where, oh my God, if we don't stop Putin here, he's going to keep rolling and getting us. And Keene here again uses that exact same commentary on ISIS, this tiny little branch of an Islamic violent group in Afghanistan that threatens the Taliban. Ironically, that's who's the biggest conflict over there, is between the Taliban and ISIS. But he's saying, oh no, but then they'll get bigger, and then they'll go to Europe, and then they'll come to the United States. No, they're not good. Even if they want to, the capacity is just not there, because we have good systems in place, especially since 9/11, to be able to track and identify global terrorist threats from anywhere that they may come, that are going to come and get us here. We have a way to stop them, and there's a reason why they haven't succeeded. But there's no reason why the terrorists that are going in Afghanistan is going to be somehow this, horrible fare that we have to have troops on the ground forever. Understand that, because what Jack Keene is saying, and you're going to see some of Petraeus here shortly, saying basically the same thing. We should never have withdrawn, and we should never withdraw. Anywhere we have troops, we should leave them there forever. We should keep our troops forever in Iraq, forever in Syria, forever in Africa, that we have a number of places, in Somalia, for example, Niger, all these places. Anytime you ever say, hey, we should withdraw our troops from here, they, jump and say no. This report that came out didn't say that America is under, renewed threat from terrorist strikes from ISIS in Afghanistan. They just said that they're growing. And so he immediately leapt all this additional area to warn you, to make you think, oh my God, we really do have to, maybe we should send more troops back there. Or of course, they'll use that to more likely to say, don't ever leave any of these other places. And folks, this is a huge dissipation of American power. When we keep having to have thousands upon thousands of American troops scattered throughout the world, especially throughout the Middle East, doing missions that have nothing to do with our national security, we dilute our own national security capacity. Because while those troops are there, they're not training on high intensity warfare with Russia or with China, for example, if that should ever be necessary. Instead, they're basically sitting in the desert doing nothing, just waiting to see if a bomb's going to drop on them. It's the most egregious waste of our resources and unnecessary risk to our troops that can be imaginable. 3 already paid that price over a month ago in Jordan. And we've been advocating that they return the rest. But if you have listened to people like Jack Keene, these war firsters, they're going to say, no, keep them there forever. Don't ever bring them back. There's no militarily attainable objective. There's no end state involved. It's just keep our troops in the ground forever. You hear this over and over. You're gonna hear more here. But let's look at some of the exact things. Let's go back to the playbook that David Sachs was talking about there. Is there, in fact, were there, in fact, people who were saying all along that this was crazy? Now, we've had Matt Hull on here a lot, and back in 2009, he resigned from the State Department in resistance to the policies of then President Obama about what he was doing in Afghanistan, because he saw already that it wasn't going to work. I actually wrote a piece the following year in the Armed Forces Journal while I was still on active duty. Gary, if you can bring that one up there. Yeah, I said that, look, this war is on the brink of failure. There are 7 things that stand in the way of success in Afghanistan. And I specifically wrote, absent a major change in the status quo that currently dominates in Afghanistan, the U.S.-led military effort there will fail to accomplish the president's objectives. And despite our best efforts to spin it otherwise, we will lose the war in Afghanistan. And certainly that's exactly what happened. Of course, you can't hide the fact that in August of 2021, a full decade later, all the egregious waste of resources and everything else, it exactly turned out the way that Matt Ho and I and a handful of others said at the time would happen. What irked me enormously was, at the same time that I was warning that there were very predictable reasons why our war would fail, you had people at the highest levels trying to convince you otherwise. One of the most famous was David Petraeus. The same year I wrote what you just saw here, he told the American people this.
In response to the threat posed by these extremists, ISAF forces and our Afghan partners are engaged in a campaign intended, above all, to prevent reestablishment of transnational extremist sanctuaries in Afghanistan, like the ones al-Qaeda enjoyed there when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan prior to 9/11. Meanwhile, the efforts to increase the size and capability of the Afghan National Army and police are also now on track, though there clearly is considerable work to be done in that critical area and to sustain the gains that have been made recently in recruiting and attrition. Even as we continue the effort to complete getting the inputs right, the actions taken over the last 18 months, which include tripling the U.S. force contribution and increasing similarly the U.S. civilian component, have enabled the initiation of new efforts in key areas in Afghanistan.
Now, as it turned out, about 4 or 5 months later, after he made those statements, I deployed into Afghanistan as part of Petraeus' surge, a part of President Obama's surge of 30,000 troops, you may recall. Now, at the time I saw that, I thought, wow, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe things are getting better. Maybe that we're not going to lose the war after what I said. I said, well, I really thought that it was going to work that way for the practical reasons that were in that article, but maybe I was wrong. So I was going to be happy to be proven wrong, and in fact was eager to get to Afghanistan because I wanted to be part of whatever we were doing that was going to bring that war to an end, end the suffering for the Afghan people, and of course make it safe for the United States. But when I got there, I saw, to my anger and frustration and disappointment, that everything that Petraeus said was a lie. And I say a lie, and not just that his assessment was wrong, because with the information that he had it in his possession, the knowledge that he possessed, he knew, he should have known anyway, that what he was saying was not going to work. That I don't know if he was just hoping that later on things would change. I can't get into his mind. I can tell you, though, absolutely for a fact that what he said was wrong. And in fact, the longer that I served on that 1-year deployment, the angrier and angrier I got, because I saw that American men were dying and having their limbs blown off and devastated for the rest of their life over a lie. And when I got back, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't stay silent. So I wrote another piece in the Armed Forces Journal that talking about the lies that were going on in Afghanistan. The New York Times picked it up, and then they ran this thing that called me a whistleblower, which I didn't actually like that title. I just said, no, I'm just telling the truth because I have to. There's no way about it. And I was interviewed by, I believe it was PBS, shortly after that time, after that article came out, a number of media outlets. And I was asked why I did some of these things and what I thought. Here's how some of that interview went.
When you have a certain amount of information that you know things are a certain way, and then you convey them in public in a way that contradicts that, that's hard to get by with, to say that that's not intentional, or knowing that we're trying to make you think something that's not so. You know, if this was the 3rd or 4th or 5th year even of the war, then you could say, well, we need to continue being that optimistic and go. But when you see the same comments from 2004, especially about the Afghan National Security Forces, from 2004, these guys are increasingly taking the lead. They're, getting out there. They're gaining the support of their countrymen. Only in the 11th year, you still don't see physical evidence of that. I have frankly lost my confidence in the ability of some of the senior leadership of the Army to police itself. And based on what I had seen over an extended period of time, and then what I had definitely seen in Afghanistan, it was clear that just going, quote, through the chain of command was going to accomplish nothing. And so I believed the only chance that there was to actually get some kind of something to fix this situation, to where we're just being honest about what's going on, is it's going to take some external help. And that's why I went to Congress.
Now, to their credit, a number of congressmen, both in the House and in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, met with me, agreed with what I had said because they could see the evidence of it, and did try to help. But there was far too few of them that were willing to do anything else. And especially because in the immediate aftermath, of course, news media, because it hit the New York Times, so now it's everywhere, everyone was talking about it. So they went and stuck a microphone in the face of all these generals, and they would say stuff like, well, yeah, I saw the Davis report. That's his perspective. That's what it is. But he doesn't see all I see. And from where we see, this is from the Commander General Scaparrotti at the time. He said, from where I see, that the things are still working in the right direction. Petraeus is right. Over time, you'll see this is going to work out. And so most of the major media went, okay. Congress continued to fund the money year after year after year, until finally, by 2021 in August, spin was finally crushed by reality on the ground, as me and several others said that it would. And it was self-evident, if you're willing to look at it realistically, you knew that outcome was going to happen. And because you had seen the fragility of the Afghan government, you've seen the incapacity of the Afghan military, and despite all the billions of dollars we put in there to try to build them up to be a self-sustaining group, which was allegedly always the case, they fell apart and it finally collapsed. Well, naturally, who's the major media going to go to find out what happened and what the reasons were? Then the very architects for it. And just like David Sachs said in his, the NEOCON Playbook, they blamed everybody else but themselves, as this interview from 2021, David Petraeus answering that question.
Certainly there was a sustained commitment that could have been pursued. 3,500 troops with a lot of drones and a lot of air power and 8,500 coalition forces, and perhaps most importantly, the contractors still on the ground.
So he's saying the same thing that Jack Keane said a couple of days ago. We just should have stayed there forever. We should never have left. And if we had just continued to do that, then this wouldn't have happened. But you know what? That itself is a lie. And I'll either it's a lie or he has shocking levels of incapacity and doesn't understand how things work on the ground, which is humiliating. And in either case, it's dead wrong. And you don't need to look any further for proof of that fact. Then you look at what we did from that surge that David Petraeus promised President Obama it would work, all the way through to the end where we had this big surge of troops. We killed a lot of Taliban. The Taliban grew. They got stronger and they got stronger. And then when finally, for political reasons, Obama withdrew anyway, the numbers kept going up. So every time we kept bombing them and all and killing them and having these strikes and drone strikes, attacks that he was just talking about here, their number continued to grow. They got stronger. And then at the end, we had, he was talking about 3,500 troops and some contractors. That's a drop in the bucket. I was there when there were 140,000 U.S. and NATO troops. And even then, we could not quell it. And they continued to grow. So the idea is laughable that 3,500 troops sitting basically in Kabul and Kandahar and Bagram Air Base are going to have any influence over the whole country, whether it's the Taliban or ISIS that was already on the process of coming up at that time. So they rose even when we had troops on the ground. We never had enough with those 3,500 to contain them. But the irony is, and the perversion is, that they want to say that we want to keep them there forever anyway. And because there is no attainable objective here. We just want to keep them there forever and keep this going on, because otherwise they'll say the same things every single time they do. In 2019, Trump tried to get the troops out of Syria because that military attainable objective of driving ISIS out of its territorial acquisitions had been accomplished in both Iraq and in Syria. By all reason and rights, we should have withdrawn then, and Trump actually announced that they're going to withdraw. But the institution and the so-called swamp in Washington, D.C. would have none of it, and they went on full court press to prevent that. And unfortunately, Trump wasn't strong enough, even though he had the authority and the power, and he allowed them to overcome him, and he didn't pull them out. Otherwise, those 3 troops that were killed last month in Iraq, in Syria, basically over the border with Jordan, would be alive today. And who knows if there's more that are yet to die because we're not willing to pull them out. But you see the mentality there. They will fight tooth and nail to keep the troops there everywhere. That's the Middle East. Now we're going to look at why it still matters in the Russia-Ukraine war and what the implications are for our national security. So we had, first of all, we'll go back to last month when this issue of this supplemental so-called national security bill, weirdly named since it has nothing to do with American national security, but President Biden wants $95 billion for Ukraine, for Taiwan, and for Israel. Nothing for our border. So nothing for our national security, but for all these other people, because we just have to give our money away to other people. Even though you can make a strong argument that's not useful, it's not going to work, as I've told you many times, but they want to do it anyway. So Biden basically made this oddly campaign commercial to try and tell people to give the money. Here's what he said in February.
We have to stand up to Putin. and passed the national bipartisan bill, the National Security Bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught. And prove to the world once more, America can't be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin.
So to reiterate, from the first of the war in February 2022 through about the first 18 months of it in the summer of 2023, we have the U.S. and Europe together contributed over $200 billion, thousands upon thousands of military vehicles, support, intelligence, millions of rounds of artillery, hundreds of millions of rounds of other ammunition, missiles, interceptors, air defense systems, you name it, all this stuff. And it did not dent the Russian lines. Ukraine spent a half a year preparing. We spent a year and a half of getting them all this kit ready to launch an operation, and it didn't succeed at all. In the days since, now then they're starting to lose even what they've had because they are bleeding human capital far faster than they're losing even military equipment. There is no military path to victory for Ukraine, period. It doesn't matter how many artillery shells we may produce. It doesn't how much cash we give them. There is no rational military path to Ukraine victory ever. Russia has actually been spending more time deepening their defensive positions, even on their side, as they're going on the offensive, which means there is no probability, whether in 2024 or 2025 or beyond, that Ukraine is suddenly going to amass enough people, personnel, gear, equipment, training, and knowledge to be able to unseat that. It's just not going to happen, period. And yet, instead of recognizing that patently obvious, very practical military reality and having that affect our policy so that we start attaining or going after something that has a shot of success, yesterday or day before yesterday, you had the CIA director Burns go before the American people in Congress on front of all these cameras and say, again, we have to have this money because if we don't, it'll be our fault if it loses. Watch this.
I think down one road with supplemental assistance approved by the Congress lies the very real possibility of cementing a strategic success for Ukraine and a strategic loss for Vladimir Putin's Russia. It's our assessment that with supplemental assistance, Ukraine can hold its own on the front lines through 2024 and into early 2025. Without supplemental assistance in 2024, you're going to see more of Avdiivkas. And that, it seems to me, would be a massive and historic mistake for the United States.
So you see right there, he is saying, listen, if we get this money, it'll be a strategic loss for Ukraine. 60 billion. 200 billion didn't dent the lines, but 60 billion, suddenly that's going to turn into a strategic loss for Russia. Even though everything in the world on the Russian side is stronger, more trained, more capable, and much larger, and all of those are growing than the Ukraine side. Still, he wants to make this claim, but then he's going to lay the foundation saying, but if we don't give them this money, then they're going to start losing more territory, as though with this money, they'll do what they didn't do with triple the amount in the previous year and a half, but they're going to do it with this one. But if it doesn't work, then it'll be your fault. So we've got to give them money. That's what he said. Now, yesterday, there was additional news coming out of the White House again to where National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that magically we found 300 million extra bucks. So we'll let him put it like this.
On behalf of President Biden, I'm announcing an emergency package of security assistance of $300 million worth of weapons and equipment to address some of Ukraine's pressing needs. This is possible because of unanticipated cost savings in contracts that DoD negotiated to replace equipment we've already sent to Ukraine through previous drawdowns. When we sent Ukraine weapons last year, we negotiated contracts to replenish those weapons in U.S. stockpiles. We budgeted the full amount of appropriated funds for those contracts. It turns out we negotiated well. Those contracts came in under budget, so we have a modest amount of funding available. And to put a fine point on it, we're able to use these cost savings to make this modest amount of new security assistance available right now without impacting U.S. military readiness.
Okay, let me tell you what he didn't say, because what he did say makes no sense in light of other facts. So he claims that this $300 million was found because of some great job we did in negotiating some contracts to replenish our stuff. Explain how that's the case when Politico had just published an article that talked about how we were in a $10 billion hole because of how we had mismanaged, allegedly, our process of the previous rounds of funding that we had given Ukraine, because of all of the weapons that we are now not able to replace from our own from our own inventories. Here's basically what happened. So when we gave a lot of these presidential drawdowns, is the phrase that you may have heard, where we're giving our existing stuff to Ukraine, some of these thousands of military vehicles and the millions of shells of our inventory that I've mentioned before. So let's just say that there was a particular missile cost $100,000, a Stinger missile perhaps. So we said, okay, Congress allocated X number of billions of dollars. So we're going to, and these missiles cost, because they just said it does, $100,000 each. So we're going to give them these and send them on over. Well, to replace the missiles in our inventories, it's not $100,000. That may have been what they cost 15, 20 years ago when they were first manufactured, but it's now it'll cost them more around $200,000. So you're saying that we're going to replenish our stuff and we're going to send this stockpile over there, but you know for sure that to replace them is now going to be double that cost. So now then you spent, let's say, $113 billion and you sent it over there, but to replace it's not going to cost $113 billion. It's going to cost $200 billion or something like that. That's, at least generally speaking, that's the way it was going to work. They knew this. And so now then there is a $10 billion hole in our ability to replace what was lost. How then can it be that when there's a $10 billion hole specifically to replace the stuff that we've already given away, can Jake Sullivan claim that here's $300 million, which is a drop in that bucket, that's saved because we did good on making these contracts to replace our stuff? It doesn't make any sense at all. If anything, that $300 million should have gone back into offset that $10 billion hole, only 0.3 of one of those 10, but at least it's moving in the right direction. That's what we should have done. Why, if there's a $10 billion hole in our inventories, should we give another $300 million that was allegedly found to another country yet again? Why would we want to do that? Of course, that means we're going to send more of our artillery shells and several other categories of gear, according to what they later published. That's where the stuff was going to come from, which of course will cost more to replace for each one of those rounds that are sent. No answer on that. No discussion at all on how that's going to work. Moreover, even more alarming, the United States Army Europe will have to cease operations, all of its operations and training and everything it's doing by the end of May, just a couple of months from now, unless Congress passes this supplemental. Well, now how can that be, you may ask? How is it that the Army didn't budget itself to fund its operations in the U.S. Army Europe and in Africa, the central part of what we're doing, especially with this Russia and Ukraine war going on? How can that be? Well, because we spent money that was allocated by Congress for the Russia-Ukraine war to help Ukraine. So much so that now then, without additional funding, we can't even conduct our own operations. That is shameful, and it's humiliating and angering that we are continuing to put our own national security at risk by undercutting our own capacity. It makes no sense why we would keep doing this. And just like David Sachs had talked about before, this war firster mentality, neocons, whatever tag you want to put on them, is always about, we always have to throw all this money else everywhere. Oh my God, they're coming after us. How many times have I played a clip of one leader or opinion maker after another here in this country that said they're coming after us next? know for sure that if Russia beats Ukraine, they're rolling for us next. And this is for us. We have to do this. Zelensky constantly makes that statement. We're fighting for you. And we're doing it. We're giving them money. Even though the war can't be won, even though it won't matter how much we give them, because the fundamentals that go into national military combat power and the fundamentals of war itself are decisively shifted to Russia. And this war can't be reversed on that. It's just too late. It's clearly past the point of no return. So the question is, why should we keep doing this? Why, in this environment, would we want to weaken our own national security at the expense of doing what makes sense and what is achievable, which could strengthen our ability to secure ourselves? It's just irrational and alarming. And look, these things all have consequences, aside from those that specifically that are being paid and are already accruing to us. There are some additional ones, and we're going to come back this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. and we're going to tell you what the real dangers are, because the other side of this equation, Vladimir Putin in Russia, is not taking this stuff lying down. And he has warned that, yeah, as you see there, he's ready. He said in an interview published today, along with some other things recently, that if NATO continues to do what it's doing and it continues to push the red lines further and further into Russia, that he's willing to use nuclear weapons. It seems that we think he's bluffing. So all these things I've told you throughout this episode here are all alarming and troubling, just generally because they have caused a lessening and a weakening of our capacity to defend our country, straight up. But if we keep going forward with this, if we remain blind, there could be another much more severe cost to our country. And we're going to talk about that this afternoon. You're not going to want to miss that. We are unintimidated and uncompromised on this channel, folks. And even when the news is bad like this, you can count on us to bring it to your attention, because our objective is to publish this as much as possible, to make regular people aware that the nonsense that comes out of official Washington is not only dumb in some cases, it's outright harmful to us. And we want to hold their feet to the fire. And we want you to be a part of this and to come along with us, because we're all in this together. If anything goes sideways, folks, this is going to affect all of us. And you need to be aware of this and have your eyes open. We're going to continue to do that. Come back this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. to see the other half of this story. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Latest Deep Dive.